My topic this morning is the cost of justice. And I have to admit, I never thought my path would bring me to where I am today. If you had told 20-year-old Jennifer that she would be writing and presenting sermons to Unitarian Universalist congregations, she would have looked at you as though you had three heads. You know whativist? What? Not only had I zero intent of ever going to church, I hadn't even heard of Unitarian Universalism. My, how things do change. And now I find myself pleasantly surprised about being the sermonator, which is what my husband calls it. It's not just writing the sermon, though. It's the preparation I find that I really enjoy. I am listening and reading to way more UU sermons and articles than I ever would have imagined. Sermon writing for me has been a great way to explore ideas and learn about history from voices I probably would not have come across otherwise. Sometimes the listening and reading of sermons is part of the work I do with my church's worship committee. I'm a member of Butman Bridge down in Jacksonville. And that's to help choose a recorded sermon for our own services. Sometimes we get a video from a UU minister, and that's our Sunday sermon. But sometimes the research I do is just because I heard something interesting in one of those video sermons, or I found an article or something completely unrelated to a sermon. And each month, the UUA offers a theme to help guide congregations to build their worship, with February focused on justice and equity. So my home church had an unexpected opening in the worship schedule the first part of February. So we decided to present a sermon written by a UU minister that fit the theme, and it was one that I read. We chose the sermon and I read it. But in the process of reviewing potential sermons for that service, I came across a sermon titled Reparations and Beloved Community by the Reverend Joan Javier Duval. While it's not the sermon we ended up presenting, I found that I was embarrassingly uneducated about the concept of reparations. And it also made me consider, what is the cost of justice? Dr. Javier Duval starts her sermon. She tells the story of a black woman named Belinda Sutton who appealed to the government of Massachusetts in 1783 to establish a pension for herself from her deceased master. She was advanced in age at the time, and she was also caring for a sick daughter. She had been a slave since she was 12 years old. The state granted her pension, and many people consider this the first act of reparation in America. Dr. Javier Duval wrote, "There is a lot of harm to reckon with. Belinda Sutton's story is one of millions like it. When I think about building a beloved community, a community in which all are valued, we also have to acknowledge and address the devaluing of people and injury, physical and otherwise, that we have done to others. What do we do to rectify this level of harm? For centuries, formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants have called for reparations for the harms caused by the institution of slavery and the continued harm of systemic racism on African Americans. At the most basic level, reparations can be defined as the act or process of making amends for wrongs done. The National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, which nicely abbreviates to NCOBRA, describes reparations as, quote, a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. The United Nations outlines 5 conditions that must be met for full reparations: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. In one article I read, falling down the internet rabbit hole, the author actually did the math. He calculated how much he felt reparations would be worth in dollars. His end goal was to raise the average African American household income to the same as an average white American household. That would be closing the racial gap, is what the racial wealth gap is what they call that. His numbers, which were based in 2013, he wrote the article in 2014, meant that each African American in the United States would receive $33,300 for a total of $1.38 trillion for the final number. And the author, Matthew Iglesias, writes, by contrast, national income in 2013 was $16.8 trillion. That's national income. So the idea of transferring $1.4 trillion to black Americans to close that racial wealth gap is far from crazy relative to the magnitude of the crime. And in other parts of that article, he goes to initially calculate what that would actually look like when you're talking about 6 or 7 generations of harm, that the 1.4 trillion was a drop in the bucket. So you can choose to focus on the math. What does it cost in real dollars to heal the wounds of the past? And it's a sticky subject. Not everyone agrees that cold, hard cash is the answer. There are people who don't believe that financial reparations will actually solve anything. In the article, 2 black writers debate reparations. The conversation was between Celeste Headley, who's the host of Slate's Hear Me Out podcast. She discusses the idea of reparations with the Manhattan Institute's Coleman Hughes. Now, both are black, as the title suggests. But while Headley supports the idea of cash reparations, Coleman, who is a descendant of slaves, adamantly rejects the idea and has testified to this before Congress. So in the conversation, Celeste Headley asked Mr. Hughes the question. So give me a summary of your argument. You're not saying that enslaved people at the end of the Civil War shouldn't have been offered some kind of recompense, land or money? That's not your argument? And Mr. Hughes responds with, exactly. My argument is precisely that they should have been given reparations in their lifetimes in the second half of the 19th century. But once you miss the opportunity to give the actual victim reparations, the reparations claim does not survive forever. And it certainly doesn't survive down to their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild, which I think is the correct number of greats in my case. You know, people often say, well, how come black people didn't get reparations? The Jews got reparations after the Holocaust. The Japanese Americans got reparations for being interned in World War II. Well, I think that, to me, that's hypocrisy or a double standard standing from today's vantage point, because they got reparations immediately, almost immediately, after the atrocities in question. And they were actually paid to the people or their families. So the truth is, for the great majority, almost all historical crimes against people, against races and ethnicities throughout the past, say 300 years, no reparations have been paid for them. No reparations are ever going to be paid out, and those claims have timed out. So I think my position in Congress and my position today is the same, which is, I actually support reparations paid to living victims of the Jim Crow system in the South or of segregation in general. This is happening in Evanston and outside of Chicago, where they're trying to identify specific individuals that were denied loans on houses because they were black in the 1960s and paying them specifically, or at most their immediate family members. That I support. That's the kind of reparations I support and is in line with my principles. What I don't support is reparations paid to descendants of slaves for slavery, which ended in 1865. It's a fascinating debate. I can see both sides of the argument. It also sent me looking for other information about reparations to other groups, like the Jews and the Japanese Americans. I was not familiar with that. And you know, sometimes being an open-minded liberal is like work, y'all. I mean, hours on the internet. But that digging also led me to, who are we not considering? If we really want to achieve that sixth principle, if we're talking about a world community with peace, liberty, justice for all, who have we not considered? The toothless? I hadn't thought of that. Native Americans came to mind first. Other people of color than black people, women. They wouldn't let me be a tank commander when I joined the Army. Differently abled people. And while not enslaved necessarily, have not these groups been subjected to injury because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families, to use the definition that was offered earlier. On top of that, these are just groups within America that I can think of. Are we not aiming for a world community? And then I got overwhelmed. Hold up just a minute. My family wasn't even in the United States when most of these horrors took place. As far as I know, none of my great-grandparents were born in the United States. Never mind 6 grades back, I don't even know who they were. On my mother's side, only my grandmother was born in the United States. And on my father's side, the history's not as clear, but it's not like anyone I'm descended from ever owned a slave. And then I read a homily written by Dr. Taqiya Nur Amin, a Union minister, entitled The Call of Our Faith. And part of that reads, ask yourself, what's the most loving, life-affirming thing that I can do in this moment for myself or for other people? Sometimes it's get some rest. Sometimes it's apologize for something you've done. Sometimes it's reconsider how you're using your money or other resources in the broader world. To me, if we're talking about racial justice, love is about acknowledging that there has been wrong, that there has been harm perpetrated, and that whether you personally feel like you participated in it or not, you are likely benefiting from the inequitable results of that harm. Even if you are a person who wants to say, well, I didn't participate in making things this way, that sounds familiar, if you are benefiting from the ill-gotten gains, then you have some responsibility to make things right, especially if you then turn around and say that you believe in justice and equity. You are not let off the hook, no matter what. Am I benefiting from these ill-gotten gains? Of course I am. From this point, we can make a right turn into a system of white privilege, which is a whole different sermon for a whole different day. But am I also a victim of oppression? Of course I am. I'm female to start with. That makes conversations about justice hard for some folks. There's not a clean dividing line. Oppressors can be the oppressed. Victims can be perpetrators. There is probably only a very small subsection of the American population that doesn't have a role on more than one side of the argument. But just because a task is difficult, does that mean we can skip over it or ignore it? Can we dismiss the real disadvantages suffered by our fellow Americans, our fellow humans, because it's too hard? I don't believe anyone in this room or anyone that I know would agree with that. We all know there is much work to do for the sake of everybody. The next task then falls to me to find our own action points. As UUers, we are doers, not just sayers. Deeds, not creeds, right? The only upside to the amount of justice work that needs to be done is the wide availability of opportunities to become engaged. You don't have to solve the whole problem by yourself. My congregation participates in an interfaith organization in Jacksonville, the name of which completely eludes me, and did last night, seeking to bring justice through political means, such as calling for the sheriff to offer drug court for low-level offenders and eliminating arrests for misdemeanors such as jaywalking, which creates disparities in the bail system and in the criminal justice system. And I know here you guys offer haircuts and showers, bringing social justice to the forefront. If you want even more ideas, you can go to the uua.org/justice. They have an entire page that lists all the ways that UUs are involved with justice. And it feels appropriate that as we move through the end of January, recognizing the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, which was the 20th, and into February, the month of love, and for us UUs, a focus on justice. One of Barack Obama's favorite quotes was Martin Luther King's, and we've all heard this one: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And in all my digging around, I had to share this with you. Did you know that Martin Luther King was paraphrasing part of a sermon by a Unitarian abolitionist when he said that? And this is from the Tufts University in reference to one of their museum exhibits. Theodore Parker was a transcendentalist and Unitarian preacher. as well as one of the secret six who funded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Parker's 1852 sermon, titled Justice and the Conscience, is what inspired Martin Luther King Jr.'s favorite quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Part of Parker's sermon from 1852 read, "You see a continual and progressive triumph of the right." Right meaning correct, not right as... "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. But from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." Parker was a radical abolitionist. He gave many rousing speeches in favor of abolition. He spoke at the Melodeon in Boston on the anniversary of the kidnapping and the return to slavery of Thomas Sims. And after Anthony Burns was also returned to slavery in 1854, Parker gave a sermon in Boston in which he called the Fugitive Slave Act a, quote, "new crime against humanity." Our roots are deep in justice work. And most of this morning, all I've talked about is racial justice. There's also climate justice, social justice, LGBTQ justice, economic justice, immigrant justice. How do we only have a month on the topic of justice? Oh, wait, because love is the basis of our faith, and justice is love in action. So while we might have a month where we point our sermon topics towards justice, in reality, everything we do will push the world closer to becoming that just community that we desire. And I believe, even though, like Theodore Parker, my eye reaches but a little way, the arc of the moral universe is indeed bending towards justice, and not only racial justice. LGBTQ rights, while under attack, exist. And that wasn't the case 30 or 40 years ago. Women in the workforce are still generally paid less than men for doing the same work, but we are in the workforce, and we are getting paid. I don't need my father or my husband to co-sign for a bank account or credit card for me like my mother did. Discussions about immigrant justice and climate justice are happening every day, both in the United States and abroad. And you and I, we are surrounded by UUs just like us, with our shared vision of a just world and enough love in our collective hearts to carry us way past February and into that shining future we all desire. Thank you.